Sir, that call you just took? It's a setup. The words landed softly, almost swallowed by the low jazz humming through the restaurant, but they cut clean through the air at table 12, where crystal glasses caught the warm amber light and reflected it across pressed suits and polished watches. Richard Collins didn't look up at first. He was still staring at his phone, thumb hovering over the screen, the faint glow lighting the sharp edge of his jaw. Around him, his partners leaned in, their voices low, confident, already celebrating a deal that hadn't even been signed yet. The scent of seared steak and aged bourbon drifted between them, rich and heavy, the kind of atmosphere built for men who believed they controlled outcomes. Naomi Carter stood just beside the table, her tray balanced steadily in one hand, the other resting lightly at her side. Her uniform was simple, black and crisp, the name tag slightly worn at the edges, but her eyes were fixed, not on the table, not on the glasses, but on him. "Excuse me?" one of the men muttered, barely turning his head, more annoyed than curious. A quiet chuckle followed, the kind that assumed interruption was a mistake. Naomi didn't flinch. "The wording," she said, calm, measured, like someone placing a piece exactly where it belonged. He repeated the clause twice. "That's not reassurance. That's misdirection." This time, Richard looked up. Slowly. His expression didn't change much, but something in his eyes sharpened, like a man noticing a sound he hadn't expected to hear. He leaned back slightly in his chair, the leather creaking under the shift of his weight. "And you are?" he asked, voice smooth, controlled, the question carrying more dismissal than curiosity. Naomi set a glass of water gently on the table, the ice clinking once, a small, clear sound in the quiet that followed. "Just someone who's heard that tone before," she replied. A pause. Then another chuckle, louder this time. One of the men across the table smirked openly now, shaking his head. "She's a waitress, Richard." The word hung there, waitress, like it explained everything. Like it closed the conversation before it even began. Richard exhaled through his nose, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth, not warm, not kind, just certain. "Then maybe," he said, glancing back down at his phone, "you should stick to serving tables." The table erupted in light laughter, not cruel enough to be called harsh, but not gentle enough to be harmless. Naomi's grip on the tray tightened just slightly, the muscles in her fingers holding steady, her shoulders still relaxed, her posture unchanged. The overhead light caught the edge of the glass she just placed, sending a thin line of gold across the table, across Richard's hand, across the contract folder resting just inches from his reach. Naomi's gaze didn't drop. Not to the floor. Not to the tray. It stayed exactly where it had been, on him. For a brief second, barely noticeable, something in the room shifted. Not loud, not dramatic, just a subtle tightening, like the air had become aware of something the people inside it had not. Richard tapped his screen, ending the call, and slid the phone face down onto the table. "Bring the check when we're done," he added, already turning his attention back to the deal, to the numbers, to the control he believed he held. Naomi nodded once. No argument. No apology. Just a quiet acknowledgement. She stepped back, the soft soles of her shoes barely making a sound against the polished floor, the murmur of conversation rising again as if nothing had happened. But as she turned away, the faint reflection of the table lingered in the glass wall beside her, the men, the contract, the untouched pen, and for just a moment longer than anyone noticed, her eyes flicked once more toward the folder, as if marking something invisible, something already set in motion, before she disappeared into the dim hallway beyond the dining room's glow. The kitchen door swung shut behind Naomi with a muted thud, sealing off the polished glow of the dining room and replacing it with the steady hum of refrigerators and the sharp scent of citrus cleaner. Fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a cooler, harsher tone across stainless steel counters and stacked plates. She set the tray down beside the service station, the metal edge touching the surface with a soft, controlled click, her hand steady even as the echo of that laughter lingered somewhere just beneath her skin. "Table 12 giving you trouble?" a voice called from the prep line. Marcus, the night shift cook, glanced up briefly, wiping his hands on a towel before turning back to the grill. Naomi shook her head once. Nothing I have not heard before. Her voice stayed even, but her eyes drifted toward the narrow window cut into the kitchen wall, where she could still see the edge of Richard Collins' table, blurred through glass and reflection. The men leaned closer now, shoulders angled inward, their movements confident, unaware. She reached for a folded order pad tucked into her apron and flipped it open, though she was not writing anything. Instead, her fingers paused over the blank page as her mind replayed the cadence of that call. The repetition. The phrasing. The pause before the word. Guarantee. It had not been reassurance. It had been pressure disguised as certainty. She had heard it before, years ago, in rooms she had not been invited to stay in long enough to belong. You zoning out on us? Another server teased lightly as she passed by, balancing 2 plates on her arm. Naomi gave a small, polite smile, but it did not reach her eyes. Just thinking. The server shrugged and moved on, the rhythm of the restaurant continuing without interruption, orders called, dishes plated, conversations rising and falling like waves. Naomi closed the order pad and slipped it back into her apron, her fingers brushing against something folded deep in the pocket. She pulled it out slowly, careful not to crease it further. A worn piece of paper, edges softened from time, lines of handwritten notes running across it in tight, precise script. Numbers, phrases, fragments of clauses. She scanned it quickly, her eyes moving with quiet familiarity, then folded it again and tucked it back into place. On the other side of the door, a burst of laughter broke through again, louder this time, sharper. Naomi exhaled once, slow and controlled, then reached for a clean glass, polishing it with a cloth until the surface caught the light just right. In the reflection, she could see herself for a brief second, not just the uniform, not just the name tag, but the stillness behind her eyes, the kind that did not come from inexperience but from restraint. Naomi! The floor manager called, stepping halfway through the kitchen door. His tone was clipped, professional, but there was an edge beneath it. When you go back out there, keep it simple. No commentary. Those clients spend more in one night than this place makes in a week. She met his gaze without hesitation. Yes, sir. He lingered for a second, as if expecting more, then nodded once and stepped back into the dining room. The door swung closed again, and the noise softened. Naomi picked up the tray, this time empty, its surface cool beneath her fingers. For a moment she stood still, listening, not to the kitchen, not to the voices, but to that faint echo in her memory, the one detail that refused to settle. Then she moved, pushing the door open with her shoulder, stepping back into the warm light, her expression composed, her pace unhurried, as if nothing had changed at all, even though something already had. Richard Collins did not notice the shift in the room, not yet, because everything still looked exactly the way success was supposed to look. The glasses were full, the contract rested neatly on the table, and the men around him were still leaning in with that quiet confidence reserved for people who believed outcomes could be predicted, controlled, and owned. He adjusted his cuff slightly, the fabric crisp against his wrist, then reached for the pen lying beside the folder, rolling it once between his fingers as if weighing nothing more than timing. So we are aligned, Ethan Brooks said from across the table, his voice smooth, practiced, carrying just enough authority to settle any doubt without inviting questions. His tie was perfectly centered, his posture relaxed but deliberate, and his eyes never stayed still for long, flicking between faces, measuring reactions, collecting silent agreements. All liability protections remained standard. Ethan continued, tapping lightly on the edge of the document, and the flexibility clause ensures adaptability if market conditions shift. Richard nodded once, slow and certain. The words sounded right. They always did when spoken with that kind of confidence. Around him, the others murmured in agreement, one of them already lifting his glass slightly as if the deal were already done. The low hum of the restaurant wrapped around them again, soft music blending with distant conversation, the illusion of calm settling back into place. But at the edge of the table, just beyond the circle of polished shoes and pressed jackets, Naomi stepped forward again, the tray now empty in her hands. She moved with the same quiet precision, placing a folded check holder near the corner of the table without interrupting the flow of conversation. Her eyes did not linger on the men this time. They moved instead to the contract, to the exact page Ethan had just touched. A small detail. A single line near the bottom, almost invisible beneath the structure of legal language. Her gaze held there for a fraction longer than necessary. "We should move before the window closes," Ethan added, his tone tightening just slightly, not enough to alarm, but enough to create urgency. Richard felt that shift. He leaned forward, the chair sliding an inch closer to the table, his hand finally settling over the pen. The weight of the moment pressed in, not heavy, but focused, like a lens narrowing. Across the table, one of the partners gave a subtle nod, encouraging, confident. Everything pointed in one direction. "Sign." Naomi turned slightly, preparing to step away, but something in the rhythm of the conversation slowed her movement. Not a word. Not a gesture. Just the timing. Too precise. Too rehearsed. Her fingers adjusted against the edge of the tray, the cool metal grounding her breathing steady even as her thoughts aligned into something clearer, sharper. Richard lifted the pen, the tip hovering just above the paper, the distance between decision and consequence reduced to less than an inch. The overhead light caught the ink point, reflecting a thin glint of brightness. For a brief second, the entire table seemed to hold its breath without realizing it. Then Naomi stopped. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. Just enough that the movement did not complete. Her voice did not rise. It did not interrupt. It simply entered the space again, calm, precise, impossible to ignore once heard. "If the flexibility clause is triggered," she said quietly, her eyes still on the page, "it does not adjust the terms. It transfers the risk." The words settled differently this time. Not like an interruption. More like something placed exactly where it could not be dismissed as easily. Ethan's hand paused mid-gesture. Just for a fraction of a second. Richard's pen did not touch the paper. Not yet. The room did not freeze. But something beneath it did. The words did not echo, they settled quiet and exact, like a weight placed precisely where it could not be ignored. For a moment, no one spoke. The low music continued, the soft clink of glass from a distant table carried on, but at table 12, the rhythm had shifted. Ethan Brooks blinked once, slow, controlled, his expression holding, but something behind it recalibrated. "That is not accurate," he replied, his tone measured, but tighter now, less fluid than before. He reached for the document, flipping the page back with a careful motion, his finger tracing down the lines as if the act itself could restore certainty. Richard did not move his pen. It hovered still, suspended above the paper, his gaze lowering to the exact spot Naomi had indicated. The clause was there. Dense. Layered. Written to be read quickly, not questioned deeply. Around the table, one of the partners shifted in his chair, the leather creaking softly. Another leaned forward, narrowing his eyes, suddenly interested in a section he had ignored minutes earlier. Naomi remained where she was, not stepping closer, not retreating, her tray held steady against her side. She did not repeat herself. She did not add explanation. The silence did the work for her. It is a standard flexibility provision. Ethan continued, tapping the page lightly, his voice regaining some of its earlier smoothness. It allows both parties to adapt without exposure. But the word exposure lingered just a fraction too long. Richard's jaw tightened slightly. He leaned in, bringing the document closer, his eyes scanning the paragraph again, this time slower, the confidence that had guided him moments ago now tempered by something else. Not doubt yet, but awareness. "Show me," he said quietly. Ethan paused. Just briefly. Then he adjusted his posture, leaning over the table, his fingers sliding to a different line, guiding attention away from the one Naomi had pointed out. "Here," he said. "This is where the protection—" "No," Richard interrupted, not raising his voice, but changing its direction. "The line she mentioned." The room stilled again, not dramatically, but with a subtle tightening that pulled every focus inward. Ethan's smile did not fully fade, but it thinned. He moved his finger back, slower this time, landing exactly where Naomi's gaze had been moments before. The words did not change, but the way they were read did. Richard's eyes followed each term, each conditional phrase, each embedded clause designed to soften what it actually did. Transfer. Not adjust. Absorb. Not share. His pen lowered a fraction, but still did not touch the page. It is unlikely to be triggered, Ethan added quickly, the confidence returning in tone if not entirely in presence. The scenario is purely hypothetical. Naomi's grip on the tray shifted slightly, the edge pressing against her palm, grounding her. She could feel the room leaning toward a decision again, the natural pull of momentum, of status, of who was supposed to be right. She did not move. Did not push. Just waited. Richard exhaled slowly, his breath controlled, but heavier than before. He leaned back an inch, breaking the direct line between his hand and the contract. Across from him, one of the partners cleared his throat quietly. "Maybe we take a second look," he suggested, the certainty in his voice replaced with caution. Ethan straightened, smoothing his jacket, recalibrating again. "Of course," he said, but this time the words did not carry the same effortless control. Richard finally set the pen down, not with force, but with intention. A soft click against the table surface. The deal was not signed. Not yet. And in the reflection of the glass wall behind them, Naomi stood still. Her figure small compared to the table, the suits, the weight of the moment, and yet, for the first time since she had spoken, she was no longer invisible. The silence did not last long enough to become comfortable. It shifted instead into something sharper, something exposed. Ethan Brooks closed the folder halfway, his fingers resting on the edge as if controlling how much of it remained visible. His expression stayed composed, but the warmth had drained from it, leaving only precision behind. "This is highly irregular," he said, his voice no longer aimed at Richard alone but at the entire table, reclaiming authority. "We are allowing external interference in a private negotiation." The word interference hung in the air, heavier than before. One of the partners glanced toward Naomi, then quickly looked away, as if acknowledging her presence too directly might validate it. Richard remained still, his eyes on the document, but his posture had changed. The ease was gone. His shoulders were tighter, his focus narrower. "She pointed out a clause," he said quietly, not looking up. "We are verifying it. That is not interference." Ethan's jaw flexed subtly. "With respect," he replied, "she does not have the context to interpret what she is reading." Naomi felt the words land, not loud, not aggressive, but deliberate. She shifted her weight slightly, the tray still steady in her hand, her expression unchanged. "Context does not change the direction of liability," she said, her voice calm, measured, placed carefully between the rising tension. This time, the reaction was immediate. A sharp exhale from one of the men. A chair shifting. The thin line of patience that had been holding the moment together began to strain. Richard looked up, his gaze moving directly to her now, studying her not as a background presence, but as a variable he had not accounted for. "What exactly are you saying?" he asked. Naomi did not step forward. She did not raise her voice. "If that clause is activated," she said, "your firm absorbs the downside alone. The other party retains exit flexibility without shared exposure." The phrasing was clean. Specific. Not guessed. Ethan's hand pressed flat against the table. "That is a misinterpretation," he said quickly, but the speed itself betrayed a shift. "It is structured to protect. Then why is the trigger unilateral?" Naomi asked, not interrupting, but aligning her words precisely where his left off. Another pause. Not long, but long enough. Richard's fingers tapped once against the table, a small, controlled motion, his mind recalculating. He flipped the page again, slower this time, tracing the language with more care, his earlier certainty replaced with scrutiny. Around him, the energy had changed. The men were no longer leaning in with confidence. They were leaning in to understand. "We can have our legal team review this in the morning," one of them suggested cautiously. Ethan's eyes flicked toward him, then back to Richard. "That would delay the timeline," he said, the smoothness returning, but thinner now, stretched over urgency. "Opportunities like this do not wait." Richard's gaze stayed on the document. "Neither do consequences," he replied. The words settled with a different kind of weight. Final. Not loud, but decisive enough to shift the direction of the room. Naomi felt the moment pass through its turning point, subtle but irreversible. She lowered the tray slightly, preparing to step back, to return to the role she was expected to occupy. But before she moved, Richard spoke again. "You said you have heard that tone before." His eyes met hers fully now, no dismissal left, only focus. "Where?" The question did not sound like a challenge. It sounded like a need. Naomi held his gaze for a brief second, then answered simply. "In rooms where the person speaking benefits from being misunderstood." No one laughed this time. The air held still, the edges of the moment sharpened by what had just been said. Ethan leaned back slowly, his expression resetting, calculating again, but the control he had earlier no longer sat as firmly in his hands. Richard closed the folder completely, the soft thud echoing just enough to mark the end of something that had almost happened. And for the first time that night, the outcome was no longer predictable. The conversation did not recover its earlier rhythm. It thinned, stretched, like a thread pulled too tight. No one reached for their glass. No one made a joke. The soft music still played, but it no longer blended into the moment. It sat on top of it, distant, almost irrelevant. Richard Collins remained seated, the closed folder resting beneath his hand, his thumb pressed lightly against its edge as if feeling for something still hidden inside it. Across from him, Ethan Brooks adjusted his posture again, slower now, his movements deliberate but measured, like a man recalculating not just the deal, but the room itself. "We can clarify every concern," Ethan said, his tone returning to calm, but now built on careful control rather than ease. "Nothing here is outside standard structure." Richard did not respond immediately. His gaze drifted briefly past the table, toward the glass wall, where the reflection of the room stretched faintly into the darkness beyond. For a second, his own image looked unfamiliar to him, not because it had changed, but because the certainty behind it had shifted. Naomi stood just beyond the table's edge, her presence quiet, her posture unchanged, but the space around her felt different now, no longer something the room could ignore without consequence. The overhead light softened slightly as a cloud passed outside, dimming the reflection across the glassware, turning the bright edges into something more muted, more grounded. Richard inhaled slowly, the breath controlled, then released it just as steadily. "We are not signing tonight," he said, his voice low, but clear enough to settle the decision. One of the partners nodded immediately, relief flickering across his face before he masked it. Another leaned back, the tension easing out of his shoulders, though his eyes remained fixed on the folder. Ethan's expression held, but the stillness behind it sharpened. "Delays introduce risk," he replied, not pushing, but placing the thought where it could linger. Richard's fingers tapped once against the table, then stilled. "So does speed," he said. The words did not rise. They landed. Final. The balance had shifted, and everyone in the room felt it, even if no one acknowledged it directly. Naomi lowered her gaze slightly, not in submission, but in closure, as if the moment she had stepped into had reached its natural end. She turned, the motion smooth, unhurried, her tray still empty, her footsteps soft against the polished floor as she moved away from the table. No one stopped her. No one dismissed her. The absence of both felt louder than anything that had been said. Behind her, chairs shifted, low voices resumed, but they carried a different tone now, cautious, measured, stripped of the earlier certainty. The deal was no longer a conclusion. It was a question. As Naomi reached the edge of the dining room, the light from the hallway ahead appeared cooler, quieter, a contrast to the warm glow behind her. She paused for just a fraction of a second, not turning back, but listening, as if confirming something had truly changed. Then she stepped forward into the dim corridor, the door closing softly behind her, leaving the table, the contract, and the men to sit in a silence that no longer belonged to control, but to consequence waiting to unfold. The next morning did not arrive with noise. It came quietly, wrapped in the pale gray light of early daybreak, the kind that filtered through glass towers and reflected off polished surfaces without warmth. Richard Collins stood alone in his office, 42 floors above the street, the city still stretching awake beneath him. The skyline looked the same as it always did, sharp lines, controlled structure, everything in its place. But the stillness in the room felt different. His phone vibrated once against the desk. Then again. Then a third time, closer together now, the pattern no longer random but building. He did not reach for it immediately. Instead, his eyes remained on the printed copy of the contract spread across his desk, the same clause now circled in pen, the ink slightly heavier where his hand had pressed harder than intended. Transfer of risk. Unilateral trigger. The words no longer blended into legal language. They stood out. Clear. Exposed. The phone buzzed again. This time he picked it up. 3 missed calls. 2 messages. 1 email marked urgent. His thumb hovered for a fraction of a second before opening the first message. Deal paused on their end. Requesting revision. The second came in as he read. We need to talk. Immediately. His jaw tightened, not in panic, but in recognition. The shift had begun. He opened the email next. The subject line was short. Direct. Clarification required before execution. The body was longer, structured, precise, but the tone beneath it was unmistakable. They had seen it. Or worse, someone had shown it to them. His reflection stared back at him from the dark screen for a brief second before he locked it. Behind him, the glass wall framed the city, sunlight now catching the edges of buildings, turning them gold, but inside the office, the air remained cool, controlled, almost still. He walked to the window slowly, each step measured, his mind already moving ahead of the moment, recalculating positions, outcomes, exposure. On his desk, the phone vibrated again, this time with a call. Ethan Brooks. The name lit up the screen, sharp and steady. Richard let it ring once. Twice. Then answered. What changed? He asked, not greeting, not easing into the conversation. On the other end, Ethan's voice came through, controlled, but thinner than the night before. They are asking questions, he said. Specific ones. A pause. About the clause. Richard's gaze stayed fixed on the horizon, but his focus narrowed inward. You said it would not be noticed. Another pause. Shorter. Tighter. It should not have been, Ethan replied. The word should hung between them, heavier than anything else. Richard turned slightly, his eyes falling back to the contract on the desk, the circled line almost too obvious now. It was, he said. Not accusatory. Just fact. On the other end, a faint exhale. Then, we can still restructure. But the confidence was no longer intact. It was being rebuilt in real time, piece by piece. Richard did not respond immediately. He looked at the clause again, then at the empty space beside it, where a signature could have been. Less than 12 hours. That was all that separated decision from consequence. His hand lowered slowly, resting on the desk steady. No, he said finally. Now we reassess. Everything. The call went quiet for a moment, then ended. The office returned to silence, broken only by the distant hum of the city below. Richard remained still, the weight of the morning settling in, not loud, not chaotic, but precise. Something had been avoided. And something else had begun. By late afternoon, the city had fully awakened, but inside Richard Collins' office, the air remained controlled, almost restrained, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The contract still lay open on the desk, the circled clause now accompanied by a second set of notes, sharper, more deliberate, written after the morning's calls had confirmed what he already suspected. The deal had not just slowed. It had fractured. Not publicly. Not dramatically. But in the quiet, calculated way that real damage begins. Richard adjusted his tie slightly, not out of habit, but to ground himself, his reflection in the glass panel beside him no longer carrying the same certainty it had the night before. Another message appeared on his screen. They are pulling back. Internal review initiated. He read it once. Then again. The words did not change, but their weight settled deeper each time. Across the room, his assistant stood near the door, tablet in hand, waiting for instruction, her posture professional but tense. Cancel the follow-up call, Richard said without looking up. Reschedule everything tied to that deal. She nodded quickly, turning to leave, but paused when he added, and find out where the concern originated. The question was not about blame. It was about precision. The door closed softly behind her, and the room returned to silence. Richard leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting again to the skyline, but this time he was not looking at it. He was looking through it, replaying the moment from the night before, not the conversation, not the laughter, but the exact second his pen had stopped. The exact words that had shifted everything. Context does not change the direction of liability. He exhaled slowly, then stood, moving around the desk with measured steps. The contract remained where it was, untouched now, no longer something to sign, but something to study, to understand how close it had come to becoming irreversible. His phone vibrated again, another call, another voice, another attempt to contain what was spreading quietly beneath the surface. He ignored it this time. Instead, he reached for his jacket, slipping it on with deliberate calm. Prepare the car, he said into the empty room, knowing the instruction would be heard. Minutes later, the elevator doors closed around him, the descent smooth, silent, the mirrored walls reflecting him from every angle, none of them quite matching the version he had carried into that restaurant the night before. When the doors opened again, the lobby felt brighter, louder, grounded in movement and routine, but Richard moved through it without hesitation, his focus fixed ahead. The car door opened, then closed, sealing him into a quieter space, the city now passing by in blurred motion outside the window. He did not check his phone. Did not review the contract again. Instead, he let the silence stretch, letting the realization settle fully. He had not been ruined by signing. He had been saved by stopping. And the difference between those two outcomes came down to a voice he had almost dismissed completely. The car slowed, turning onto a familiar street, the restaurant now visible ahead, its glass windows catching the fading light of the afternoon. Richard's gaze fixed on the entrance, not with urgency, not with pride, but with something quieter, more deliberate. Recognition. The car came to a stop. He did not move immediately. Just sat there for a second longer than necessary, as if measuring the weight of what he was about to do. Then he opened the door and stepped out, the city noise rushing back and around him, but his focus remained unchanged as he walked toward the entrance, not as a man in control of outcomes, but as someone finally ready to understand the one he almost ignored. The restaurant looked the same, but the air inside it had shifted in a way that could not be measured, only felt. The late afternoon light stretched long across the floor, slipping through the tall windows and settling over the tables in soft, uneven bands of gold. Glassware caught it in quiet flashes, and the low hum of conversation moved gently through the space, steady and familiar. Richard Collins stepped inside without pause, his shoes meeting the polished floor with a muted rhythm, slower than the night before, more deliberate. He did not scan the room like a man searching for status or recognition. His gaze moved differently now, lower, more attentive, as if recalibrating what mattered in the spaces he entered. At the far end of the dining room, Naomi Carter stood near the service station, folding a clean cloth with careful, practiced precision. Her movements were small, contained, her posture upright but relaxed, the same as it had been before, unchanged by anything that had followed. The light from the window brushed against her shoulder, outlining her in a quiet glow that did not ask to be noticed. Richard stopped a few steps away, not close enough to interrupt, not far enough to remain unseen. For a moment, he did nothing. No words. No gesture. Just stood there, the distance between them holding something unspoken, something heavier than apology and quieter than acknowledgement. Naomi finished folding the cloth and set it down beside her, aligning its edge with the corner of the station as if completing a task that required no audience. Then she turned slightly, her eyes meeting his for the first time since the night before. There was no surprise in her expression. No tension. Just a steady, grounded stillness, the kind that does not seek validation because it does not depend on it. Richard's breath shifted, subtle but real, the kind that comes when something internal settles into place. He gave a small nod, not formal, not performative, but precise, like a recognition finally understood. His hands remained at his sides. He did not reach into his pocket. Did not offer explanation. The absence of those things carried more weight than anything he could have said. Naomi held his gaze for a brief second, then returned it with the same quiet acknowledgement, a slight movement of her head, nothing more. The exchange passed between them without sound, but it completed something that had been left open. Around them, the restaurant continued, glasses placed, menus turned, footsteps moving in soft patterns across the floor, life unfolding without pause. Richard stepped back, the motion small, controlled, creating space again, not out of distance, but respect. He turned toward the door, the light shifting across his shoulders as he moved, the warmth of the room giving way to the cooler tones near the entrance. Outside, the city carried on, traffic flowing, voices blending, the day moving forward without hesitation. Inside, Naomi reached for another cloth, her hand steady, her focus returning fully to the quiet rhythm of her work. The sunlight lowered gradually, softening the edges of the room, turning reflections into shadows, then into something calmer. No one marked the moment. No one paused for it. But it remained, held in the space between two people who now understood something that did not need to be spoken. And as the light faded, what stayed behind was not the memory of what almost happened, but the quiet certainty of what did not, resting in the stillness like a truth that had finally found its place.